Rob Sadow is CEO and co-founder of Scoop Technologies, the hybrid work platform. Rob was previously part of the leadership team at Bain & Company, the global management consulting firm. Rob specialized in customer strategy and marketing, helping major employers connect with and deliver value to their customer base. He studied management, legal studies, and business ethics at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Please welcome Rob Sadow.
Hi, everybody. My name is Rob Sadow. I'm the CEO and co-founder at Scoop Technologies. Excited to be with you today at the BambooHR Virtual Summit to talk about the great return to office debate. Do you mandate RTO? Do you not mandate RTO? I doubt that there are many companies out there that haven't at least discussed this and debated what the right answer is. So we're going to dig into it, talk about what works, what doesn't work, what the verdict is, and make sure they leave everybody here today with a few actionable takeaways that you can think about coming out of the conference. All right, so what's the agenda? We're going to start with the current state. What's going on in the world? What are we hearing right now? 2, we'll talk a little bit about the challenge of RTO and what's causing some of the friction around return to office. We'll give a verdict on how to think about mandating RTO. We'll talk about some actions that you can take coming out of this session and how to think about implementing your flexible work environment and RTO the right way. And I'll share a few parting thoughts. Along the way, please feel free to put in any questions or comments into the chat. Would love to hear what's on your mind. Make sure that we can talk about things as we go. So really appreciate all of your time. I would love to get your input. All right, so what is the state of the world today when it comes to return to office? I am sure that if you are like me and many others, you read about it all the time. You'll hear on LinkedIn or in the news about one company and what their plans are, another company and what's going on. So what are we finding the latest to be? Well, for a lot of companies, and I think this is written about quite a bit in the media, Labor Day was this really important kind of like line in the sand where you see a bunch of companies say, look, after Labor Day, after the summer, you've got folks that now have kids back in school, schedules are a little bit more regular. Maybe that's the date that we're going to really push hard on the return to office. It was also a point where for a lot of folks, they felt like we were far enough into COVID. It was starting to reach the endemic phase. Maybe this is a time where our employees will feel more comfortable if we say, hey, look, it's important to us that you come back into the office. And so what did we see after Labor Day? Well, Gartner did some good research on this and found that just about 70% of companies were requiring employees to work from the office for at least some number of days of the week. So about 70% said you had to. 30% at that point, or 31% to be specific, said we do not yet have any requirement as to the number of days that employees need to work in the office. So what did that look like? Let's dig a little bit more deeply into that group of 70% roughly that said that employees need to come back for some set number of days. And one of the biggest changes from pre-pandemic, and it's kind of fascinating to think about how much the world has changed just in the last 2 or 3 years, only 5% of those companies said that people need to be in 5 days a week. And so in many ways, at least for companies where the type of work allows for flexibility and folks could do their jobs from home, the idea of 5 days a week in the office is fast becoming a relic. In terms of how many days was the most common, 3 days was the most common. So 25% of firms said they were requiring employees to be in the office 3 days a week. The next most common was 2 days at a little bit over 15%. And then a few percentage points each for 1 day a week, 1 day a month, and 1 day a quarter. So what ended up happening with some of these RTO requests and discussions? Well, we'll pick a few different companies as case studies here and talk about what's happened, although I'm sure we can all think of a lot of different companies and stories that we've heard over the last few months. But Apple is maybe the most prominent one, where there was a lot written on Apple's return to office and how much flexibility were they going to give to employees. Apple originally set a deadline in April of 2022 and said, look, we want everybody to be in a certain number of days of the week, and we're going to pick the days in April 2022. That first deadline ended up pushing, and then it got pushed to September 5th, 2022, so after Labor Day. There was a lot of employee pushback at Apple, which you may have seen with petitions forming and Apple Together forming. A senior person, Ian Goodfellow, who's a director in machine learning there, actually left the company in response to the push against flexible work. And so Apple was a pretty good bellwether for just some of the intensity of the discussion and the tug of war taking place back and forth at companies over how to approach the return to work and how much flexibility to give to employees. AT&T is another interesting example where early focus on work from home. And then when they started to move a little bit more aggressively toward return to office, saw a lot of pressure and pushback from employees there as well, resulting even in a change.org petition around it. So another similar example. And then Tesla, which I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with Elon Musk very famously coming out and saying, look, I want everybody in the office a minimum of 40 hours per week. And even going so far as to say that people who aren't in the office 40 hours a week can, quote unquote, pretend to work somewhere else, which I personally found to be a pretty jarring statement around flexibility and how do you think about trust of employees based on where they're working. And I think they felt that at Tesla, where there was a resource shortage, certainly an impact on morale, pretty meaningful attrition. So obviously some pretty contentious things happening at these companies as companies and employees are trying to figure out what return to office is going to look like. And so therein lies the challenge. How do you approach return to office? How hard should companies push on the return to office mandate in the set number of days? What's the employee pushback and what should employers expect? Let's dig a little bit into what those different perspectives are and maybe some of the data in terms of what's actually driving that difference in perspective. So what's the fundamental agreement, disagreement rather? I think the most important thing to recognize is that in the most fundamental way, the issue here is that employers and employees don't necessarily agree on where work should happen. And that is probably the biggest shift in my mind from where we were just a few years ago in terms of how do we think about work. For the vast majority of companies in 2019 and before, the expectation was that work just took place in the office. And the pandemic was a great untethering in many ways of work from the office. And people got really used to, over a series of months and years, the idea that they could work from a lot of different places. And so the heart of the issue is, where does work get done? I think that's where employers and employees are having the hardest time kind of getting to alignment on that topic. So what do employers want? And be careful not to paint with a broad brush, because there's a lot of different employers out there, and some employers want some things, other employers have different perspectives. But the general view, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, given that 70% of companies at this point have some expectation on a number of days in the office for their employees, the general view is that employers want employees back in the office a little bit more. And when you dig into the research on this in terms of why, the reasons that get cited most often are generally around culture, around productivity, around collaboration. I personally found this stat from Microsoft to be really, really telling in some of the work that they've done recently researching this topic. And they found that 85% of leaders say that the shift to hybrid work has made it challenging to have confidence that employees are being productive. To me, in many ways, this is the best encapsulation of the issue and the tension between employers and employees. It's not that leaders are saying that employees can't be productive. Is that they're saying they're having challenge being confident that employees are being productive. To me, I think a real core of it is it requires managing differently when you have folks out of the office. You can't just rely on seeing someone next to you in the office, maybe at the cubicle or the desk next to you, to understand whether they're working at all, and using that as the barometer. Almost inputs, in a way, is the barometer of whether someone's being productive. It requires folks to focus on outcomes and understanding whether the goal was achieved and using that as a measure of productivity. And that's really different for a lot of managers, and managers may not have been trained or be particularly good at that yet. And I think that's one of the big drivers, that this stat kind of like showed me in terms of like where some of the issue is in terms of employers getting comfortable with folks being out of the office. So what do employees want? Well, employees want flexibility. They want flexibility. And it's not just flexibility around where work happens, but interestingly enough, it's flexibility around when work happens. Future Forum does some really, really good research on this topic, and they found that 80% of employees want flexibility in where they work. 94% of employees want flexibility in when they work. So across those two, almost ubiquitous that employees want flexibility in how they think about their work, where and when it happens. And that's really the core of the issue. You've got a lack of confidence in productivity and the cultural impact for employers around employees being out of office. And that's coming up against the desire for employees to have flexibility, which is something they've gotten very used to over the last few years in the pandemic and what it's felt like to work in that period. So what does it mean in practice? Well, I think the challenge for employers, frankly, is that employees don't just want flexibility, but they're willing to put their money where their mouth is. And by that, I mean like they're willing to switch jobs over their flexibility expectations. 55% of employees, according to Future Forum, are open to looking for a new job in the next year. That number jumps to 70% if they're dissatisfied with current flexibility. So 70% of employees saying, hey, I'm going to go look for a new job potentially next year if I'm not happy with the flexibility. Just to put that in perspective, think about that in practice. If you work at a company that has maybe very strict perspective on how many days folks need to be in the office, maybe you're at a company where everyone's expected to be in 5 days a week, so you're one of that 5% that's requiring that. If you go look to your left at the person sitting in the desk next to you, and then go look at the person on your right in the desk next to you, chances are 12 months from now, 2 of the 3 of you are no longer going to be at that company. That's a tremendous burden for employers to get over. With that much turnover, it's really hard to operate. And so it's something I think every employer really needs to take seriously in terms of like how important this is. And when asked how important flexibility is, it is second only to compensation at this point, which is another just huge drastic shift from where we were pre-pandemic. And I think that really frames or encapsulates why this is such a big topic, and employers have to just wade very, very carefully into how do you think about return to office and how aggressively you mandate in that regard. All right, so what's the verdict? We talked about what employers want and some of the sensitivities they have. We talked about employees and some of their concerns. We went through a few case studies on what's happening at different companies as they push different levels of return to office mandate. You're probably not going to be surprised to hear this, but my personal perspective is sweeping return to office mandates are really, really difficult to execute. They're really hard to execute. I think people have gotten really used to flexibility. And based on what employees are saying and how important flexibility is to them and their willingness to go look at other jobs, I think it's going to cost those employers top talent over time if you're too strict and too narrow in the way that you think about flexibility. And so we actually, like, it would be helpful, I think, then to say, okay, got it. So maybe a mandate is a difficult thing to execute. So what do you do, right? Because employers clearly have some perspective that employees being in the office is a good thing. And employees want flexibility. And so how do you find some middle ground that leaves everybody feeling happy and excited about what they're doing? And I think the answer really is to stop focusing on the stick, so to speak, and focus a little bit more on the carrot. And when I say carrot, I don't mean like free things to bring people into the office. I mean, what motivates people in the first place to want to come in? Like, what's the purpose of the office in this post-pandemic world? And I think Nick Bloom at Stanford does a really nice job encapsulating this and says, look, nobody commutes for an hour for a free bagel or to use a ping pong table, right? They come into the office to catch up with friends and to work in person. Fundamentally, I think the role of the office in that way is shifting and it is moving more towards the collaboration, more external, more social types of things that you can do there versus maybe some of the more heads down type of work that happens at home. And so Future Forum found very similar thing in terms of like what's going on in their own research. and that the office really has shifted in the minds of employees, at least, in terms of what is that space for? What kind of work should get done in that space? A couple of statistics that Future Forum found that I think just capture that really well. One is that 74% of people think of the office or use the office for collaborating with coworkers, and that includes social events, building camaraderie, facilitating in-person meetings. So largely things that you can't do necessarily on your own individually. While only 16% of people say they use the office and have a quiet space to focus on work. And so the role of the office is shifting. And why is this so important when it comes to return to office and mandates? Well, each of us has our own balance or mix of how much work we do individually, that's heads down work, versus how much work is collaborative in nature. Different functions within the company operate differently in that way. Different folks at different levels of seniority may have more or less meetings or different types of work going on. And so if the office is more for collaboration and social, and people think of working from home more for heads down, then almost by definition, there's going to be different number of days in the office that are going to be useful for different people. And I think that's where some of the mandates fall down and what makes it a little bit challenging in practice. And so what do you do about that? Well, as an employer, I think some of the best things you can do is start to think about, okay, well, what are the use cases that are most valuable for employees to come into the office? And, a few examples that I think are particularly resonant ones are, one, the office can be an incredibly valuable place for new hires. You're new to a company, you want to build relationships, you want to connect and get a feel for the culture. Having new hires spend some time in the office with others can be incredibly valuable for connection. Second is maybe you're kicking off a new project in a new space and it's a new set of people working together that don't normally work together. Building new teams to take on new tasks can be a really valuable use of time for being together in person. And the third is despite how good tools and software have gotten over time for doing remote work, there's still something about brainstorming and creativity and whiteboarding and getting together in person that allows for really good in-person interactions that help breed creativity. And I think, as much as a lot of us spend time on video conference, with video conference, you sometimes have lag. You sometimes have kind of auto muting of other people when someone speaks. It's not necessarily the most conducive environment for really good brainstorming, and that can be a really good reason to get folks together in person. All right, so I promised at the beginning that we weren't only going to talk about the RTO mandate and the verdict, but I was going to make sure that everyone joining today left with something they felt like they could really take home from this and say, okay, what are things that you can take back to your company or your organization to help get flex work right and make it so that employers can accomplish what they want to accomplish and employees can accomplish what they want to accomplish. And it doesn't feel like two sides in this tense battle, but rather it's one company, one culture that can operate really effectively with flexibility. So we're going to walk through 5 takeaways. I'll go through each of them a little bit of depth, and hopefully those are things that you feel really good about and can take home. 1, what's the first thing you can do? And we'll start really big picture for a second. So create a flexible work purpose statement. So what's a flex work purpose statement? It's a statement that says, what is the business purpose behind flexible work? Why do we even do this in the first place? And having a single statement can just be a sentence or two that says, look, as an organization, why do we believe in flexible work? What's it for? It's really helpful. It's a really quick way to unify perspective across the company and employees and be like, hey, this is why we do flexible work. It's for this business purpose, right? So start there, really simple terms to get everyone on the same page. 2, I like the idea a lot of defining a few flexible work principles. And I think about this as if in number 1, you set a statement or business purpose for flexible work, let's now start to apply that in a little bit more specific way. So tactically, the organization understands how flexible work is supposed to work there. So examples might be what's the purpose of the office? What kind of work do we expect to get done in the office versus at home? When do we expect employees to be in the office? Is it because we do offsites on a regular basis and that's a good opportunity to get people together and that's part of the expectation of being to the office? Or maybe we do some kind of kickoff meeting on a regular basis for a project or a sprint or a quarterly kickoff. And that's an opportunity for everyone to get together. Or maybe there's some social event that we try and do that's part of our culture. And that's a reason we want people to come in. But let's set clear expectations around it with a reason that connects back to the business purpose and what we think of the purpose of the office to be. So a few short principles that make it really easy to understand why we do this and kind of like how it works in practice can be really helpful. And the third, and perhaps actually even the most important thing on this page, is you got to walk the talk. You just can't have a policy or an approach to flexible work and then have leadership do something different. A good example is, let's say as an organization, you decide, okay, look, we're committed to flexibility. We think this is important for us for a number of reasons. We're going to create some flexibility at the team level to decide how many days in office they're going to do, because that actually works best team by team, and different teams are doing different types of work, and that's what works for us, right? Potentially one approach. But then you have one executive that says, hey, look, I want my direct reports to be in the office every day with me because I believe in being in the office every day, and we're going to do it 5 days a week. Well, then look, then you've got something that's not kind of like aligned across your organization, right? Like you've set an organizational point of view, but you have these pockets that operate a little bit differently, and it feels inauthentic. And people are going to feel like they've got to be in the office because somebody or a particular executive is doing that too. And so what's the harm in that? Well, in my mind, I kind of think about this the same way as values in a company, right? Like values don't mean anything for your organization unless you live them and breathe them every day. It's really important. Otherwise, they're just statements that live on the wall. They almost become a joke in some ways. And so flexibility and your posture on flexibility is the same way, right? It's like, okay, if you're going to set a stance on how we think about this, then everybody's got to role model it all the way up to the top. And if you don't do that, it just won't work. All right, 2 more. And these are a little bit more tactical, but super, super important. The 4th one is train your managers. I find that companies are systematically underinvested in helping people managers be great flexible work leaders. The number of managers that have experienced more than the last few years managing in a flexible work environment is extremely small. Chances are, if you go across your organization, you look at all the managers, most folks have never had to manage in that capacity before. And they can rely on crutches, like being able to see someone next to them as a cue for whether they're working or not, instead of really having to manage by outcome and making sure that the actual team is accomplishing what they need to accomplish. And so how do you make this easy on your managers? Well, one, give them some like simple tools and kind of actions that they should take to make it easier for them. Like one, every team should have some team norms on flexible work. How do we think about flex work on this team? Are there certain days that we try to get together in the office? How do we approach that? 2, set a culture of being open, right? And actually creating the space to give feedback and receive feedback so that people feel like they can share if the policy or the approach is working for them. 3rd, and I've mentioned this a number of times, but train your managers to measure on outcomes. Did the person accomplish what they wanted to accomplish or what they were targeting to accomplish that week or month or quarter? Not just like how much work did they do or did you see them in the office, right? And that kind of stuff helps managers get better at this. And if you combine that with good training sessions for your managers or best practice sharing where you can get your managers together and let them share with each other what's working and not working, that's how you grow as a group, how everybody learns and gets better, and your people managers can be better flexible work leaders. And lastly, and incredibly importantly, use data and software to make it easier. There's a lot of great software out there that makes it easier to approach flexible work. A couple of things that we find particularly helpful are, one, using pulse surveys, just quick surveys to understand what's working or what's not working. That's a great way to get real-time feedback and course correct based on kind of like how your flexible work environment feedback is coming through. A second is make it really, really easy for your teams using software like Scoops, for example, to see work locations. So folks know who's going to be in the office and out, and you can make coordination simpler. Doesn't make it so hard on your managers to operate in a flexible environment. Third is you've got great office utilization data that probably comes out of different software that you have or badge data. And so use that to better inform how your space is used, right? Like how much space do you need? How much of it should be for collaboration versus heads down work? Your office utilization data can really help you with that. And the last is your hiring and turnover data is a gold mine understanding your employees' perspective on flexibility. Track things like how often do you lose, or how often does an offeree say they're not joining because of somebody else's flexible work policy relative to yours? Or how often in an exit interview when somebody's leaving the company do they mention something about flexibility? It'll give you a really good sense really quickly for how it's resonating and whether you feel comfortable with that or not, and you can course correct as a result. So those are 5 actions that anybody can take honestly today, going back to their company, and make it a little bit easier to operate a flex work environment without having to be so heavy-handed with a mandate on return to office that potentially sets you up for failure. All right, so a couple of final thoughts just to help wrap it up and make sure that we kind of like frame this the right way. You know, probably the most important thing to share, and I hope you all realize that just recognizing your own nuances in your organizations and how you operate, is there is no one-size-fits-all approach. There's no right answer when it comes to flexibility or wrong answer when it comes to flexibility. There's no right number of days a week in the office or wrong number of days a week in the office. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a right answer for your organization. But you've got to do the work to be able to figure that out and understand what's going to work for you, what's going to fit based on the type of work you do, the type of culture you have, the executives you have, the employees you have. You got to do the work to find out what's right for your organization. And so how do you do it? Well, there are a few things you just got to keep in mind. One is get a good read on what your employees want. Pulse surveys and other feedback is going to be gold for you in figuring this stuff out. The second is leverage your technology to make it easier on your middle managers, the way that we talked about, so that they don't have such a heavy lift. If your middle managers feel really good about flexible work, it's a lot easier for your org to figure it out. Third is use that data and be transparent about the findings to course correct and get better. And the fourth, and honestly, my personal favorite, is be open to learning and iterating. Like, this is new for everyone. This is, in some ways, take a step back. Flexible work is an experiment taking place at global scale that we are all going through at the same time. It's not like a lot of companies have been doing this for 10 or 20 or 30 years. We're all learning together. And so be open and honest around that. Like, we're going to learn, we're going to make mistakes, we're going to get good feedback, we're going to course correct. And as a result, we're going to get better and better at it, and we're going to find the right answer for our organization. All right. Well, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it. If you want to learn more about flexible work or see data trends, we do a ton of that work at Scoop. You can find it at our website, www.takescoop.com. I also personally write a lot of content on this on LinkedIn, and so you can feel free to follow me on LinkedIn for more insights on this topic. And then otherwise, if you want to get in touch, here's my email, rob@takescoop.com, our business email address, business@takescoop.com for the company. Follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter, and we'll be excited to help you in any way we can with your flexible work journey. So happy flexible working. Enjoy the rest of the conference. And again, thank you so much for your time. Take care.